Hello, colleagues. In this video, let me discuss how to report the findings of your research in the article in a way that international readers can understand, follow, and appreciate. There are some challenges that we'll address in this segment too, because the findings of your study may be valuable to you. They may be in a context that is familiar to you. That doesn't mean that people from the outside will be also able to understand and value the findings the same way you do. This means that you have the additional challenge of trying to, one, make sure that they understand the findings in relation to the research question or hypothesis or the context in which you do the research. And second, they also understand the value of that finding in your context. So you need a little bit more explanation, explication, or clarification or accessibility. Here are some methods. One would be to contextualize and just tell them in this context, here is how dry the soil is, or how wet the soil is, or here is how the curriculum development is done in our academic context. Here is how we do something. So you may need to provide the context in order to present the finding. Otherwise, the finding may not look necessarily significant to them. Then you might want to also highlight the global relevance when you're presenting your local findings, meaning if you study the global literature and even as you present the findings, make sure that you put it in that global context, then they're more likely to value. Sometimes that may come from comparing your findings with previous findings. Some of it will happen in the discussion. So it may be a good idea to put the findings and discussion at the same time for international journals, because when you just present the findings only, your international readers may not understand. So don't think you are the person struggling to communicate. They're the people struggling to understand. So think of it as you need to help them to understand, to follow, and to value your presentation. Another one would be to emphasize uniqueness of your contribution. If you emphasize how your contribution is unique in relation to the global literature, in your referencing and discussion, they will understand, aha, here's what we understand, but here's what this new person is presenting in new evidence. Identifying gaps may be one thing, although sometimes it may be difficult to call it a gap because one thing is true in one context, something is unique in another context. Is it a gap or is it an addition? So it may be an extension to the understanding, but be very clear and bold and courageous when you do that. They need to know that you're contributing something new. Speak with confidence. If you have used innovative methods, put that in context. And when you're writing theoretical articles, you may want to discuss the theoretical evidence or discussion in the local context in relation to global understanding. In whatever you do, it is unnecessary to engage the global literature. Without engaging the global literature, you're not going to engage the global audience. So cite the international studies as well as studies that validate your problem and finding and discussion in the local context. So if you combine the local and global, you're more likely to do it. Because sometimes you cite global literature, but you only present local finding. Without local literature, it may become difficult to convince the readers because they will say, hey, where is your local scholarship? What are other people in your context saying? So don't hesitate to put the global local in the literature review and the local global in the discussion. This way, your findings will be presented more effectively. Of course, you need to be more accessible, more clear in your writing. You have the additional burden of the other person not understanding you. Don't just blame them, make it easy. And that means you may want to use visuals and also integrate labels and explanations of the visuals more clearly. You might want to use metaphors and analogies and storytelling techniques. These can make it easy for the reader to understand your writing, your findings cross-culturally. For example, if somebody is studying dry soil in northern Nigeria, for example, and the international reader may not understand how really, really dry that soil is, and how the idea of the biome or the chemistry or the soil characteristics may not be easily understood by people in North America. You might want to explain how arid the soil is and to give a little bit of a context in which your findings are presented. That's an example. The same thing is true in the discussion, but I'm just trying to highlight how important it is to make sure that your finding itself is easily understood and maybe present the findings along with the discussion to make sure the readers are not lost. Let's go a little deeper into that. Let's unpack that. One is whenever you're drafting the findings, that you organize the empirical research findings by major areas. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 findings. That organization may be driven by the hypothesis, findings related to hypothesis 1, hypothesis 2, 3, 4, and 5. Or it may be depending on what you found. The question may be 1, but your findings are 5 because you found 5 important things that you want to report. Then organize the finding. Although you do not discuss the findings, if the findings is separate, you do need to organize by theme. So when you start discussing, you can refer back to each of the themes, each of the key areas of findings. In review articles, it would be more fluid. So you may not have many segments. You may have just paragraphs. But if you can provide subheadings and subsections, it's a good idea to say political implications and social implications and economic issues and psychological issues, whatnot, so that there's a little bit of a splitting up and organization in the findings. Findings are easy to follow when it is chunked, when it's blocked into separate sections, like 4, 5, 6 segments. We'll talk about that a little deeper here. Finding in empirical research, finding in review and theoretical articles, and others. Let's go to the empirical research. In the empirical research, as I said, the sections are based on major areas or major themes, depending on the nature of your article or research. And if it is thematically significant areas of study, you would organize by theme. If it is findings based on hypothesis, it'll be based on hypothesis or research question. But when you are presenting the data, use signals. First, or the major finding, another major finding, a third major finding, a fourth major finding. Or you might say regarding X, regarding Y, or in relation to hypothesis 1, in relation to hypothesis 2. That kind of signaling can also help a lot, whether or not you have the subheadings and subsections. Then tables and figures can, within the subsections, tables and figures can really help to report the finding in ways that are easy and accessible. Most of the time in sciences and even social sciences, people really look at the figures and tables and then look at the text around it if they want to understand the context, but figures and tables are important. In the humanities, it's not easy to present your findings in figures and tables. In social sciences and in the hard sciences, it is, and engineering and medicine, the figures and tables are essential. But keep it objective. Remember, as I've been saying in this video series, findings should be objective, they should be concise, they should be focused on the goals of the research or questions or hypothesis. That way, findings are not mixed up with discussion. If you do want to combine the findings and discussion, you still try to say, here's what we found, here's what it means. Here's what we found, here's what it means. Here's another finding, here's what it means. That language should still distinguish findings and discussions so that you're not accused of mixing up findings with your interpretation. And then when you're structuring your findings, clear and descriptive language, especially the use of past tense. Here's what we found. Because the research is over, you're reporting now, and you say, we found that. It showed that. We studied this, and we located this, identified this, and that kind of language. Avoid overloading the audience with data and details, because sometimes you need to block out what is really significant, what is related, what is relevant, what is important. Of course, if your findings have undermined the original assumptions or hypotheses, you do need to report that. That's not the point. The point is, don't go into unnecessary detail. And if the findings need to include the complexity or the nuances, reshape the whole structure, but within the structure, don't go too far, too deep, unnecessary, irrelevant details. And then always highlight the key findings when you begin and when you end, so that people can follow, okay, this is where I am. And then there is a convention of presenting the major findings first instead of the minor findings first. Follow that convention. That's the expectation that people have when they read. And then if there's secondary findings or findings not asked in the original questions, research question or hypothesis, those can also be presented separately in some cases. All right. Now, when using tables and figures, choose the format that people use in that journal. A lot of times, the right type of figures are necessary, not only figures. So it's a matter of learning the skills to use the tools and to use the technologies to generate the figures and to format them and to label them in ways that are conventional in the discipline. I cannot generalize here, and I'm not in a field that uses a lot of tables and data, but I do teach other students how to do it effectively. And I always see it very different in different disciplines. Follow those conventions of the discipline. Label clearly and consistently, especially consistently, because if you label the same figure, similar figures in different ways, people will misunderstand. So follow the same pattern within your article. And then, of course, make them accessible. Don't make your figures and graphs blurry, pixelated. Oftentimes, journal articles want the original shot, original image, so that if it gets pixelated in the process of back and forth, they may demand the original picture, so save them. And then integrate findings into the text so that the text can provide depth and context. And if you're doing finding and discussion together, you're also going to provide interpretation and explanation against the finding. As an example of presenting finding clearly, if hypothesis one is one segment, you would present key finding to show that it was true. If another hypothesis turned out to be not true, it was not proven true, then you might separate that from the one that was proven true, and that kind of thing. If you're reporting the finding review articles, oftentimes you're synthesizing existing literature, but remember, you're not following the literature. You're trying to present the findings based on your goals of argument of or objective of the article, and therefore you organize by your theme and argument. One, maybe you identify the key themes and trends by using a narrative framing, maybe. Second, you may compare and contrast past studies in order to illustrate the theme that you want to discuss and explore, or you may highlight the gaps in the literature in order to advance your argument. Please go back to our discussions of how to engage existing literature for more on this, but you do need to organize even when you're doing lit review-based reporting. And do integrate findings into the discussions when you're doing literature review. In literature review article, it's not a good idea to separate the literature review and the discussion. I think it's a good idea to put the findings and discussions within the same segment, go back and forth between literature review and findings. In scientific articles, it's more common to present the findings and discussions separately. Here, it's more common to put finding and discussions in the same section with signals separating what is your finding and what is your discussion. If you are working on other types of articles, like case studies, you may want to go very detailed in the narrative of the case study, right? You might want to present the context and the people involved and the process involved and what you found, and then you may go into analysis. The narrative details and analysis are common even before you start discussing, right? So analysis is a key word here. If it is methodological papers, you may want to check if your method is valid and how it applies and explain how it applied in practice. And in theoretical articles, you may want to focus on the conceptual development as the guiding principle for reporting your findings or presenting evidence. As I said, language of finding is more objective. Language of discussions is more subjective, discursive at least. And then the statistics and data, the results also make it descriptive rather than discursive. And interpretation and speculation is saved for discussion, just to highlight. And if you want to distinguish the language of discussion in this context, you will see interpretive and analytical language in discussion. You will be relating results and hypotheses to existing scholarship or theories. And you also go into implications and significance, limitations and future research, all that broader field work in the discussion. Let's put that together in the form of what the language looks like, okay? If it is findings, you would say the data showed a 20% increase in blah, blah, blah. In the discussion, whether it is together or separate, you might say the 20% increase in da-da-da suggests that. That is the language of discussion, right? Showed versus suggests, past versus present tense. If you're doing it sort of together, the data showed a 20% increase in participant engagement, which suggests that. You could also sometimes do this if you're blending it. Just to highlight when to combine them and to separate the findings, there are different factors involved. One is when a journal really wants you to separate your findings. If that is what the journal expects, that's what you do. Or it could be because of the kind of data that you have. If your data is complex and it requires detailed presentation of the data, because before you can go to the findings, then you might want to present the data itself. If there's a clear distinction between data and presentation or interpretation, and which happens in the field of science, then you present them separately. But you may combine it if the journal wants you to combine that, or the study has straightforward data and really there's not much to say. You want to go into discussion And third, it may be you want to integrate the findings into the flow of the narrative or the discussion. Or you're leaning on the theoretical or the review article, then they tend to go together. So the more objective, the more separate, the more massive the data, the more separate. But the lesser the data and more significant the discussion, the more likely it is to be combined. Those are a few basic things about drafting the finding segment. We will be following up with our discussions and activities. Looking forward to the workshop. Thank you very much. Gracias.